Today we're looking at Unleashed by Boris Johnson, and the thing being unleashed in the book is not Boris Johnson himself, it is the country. This was published this year, and I always like to read the accounts of the outgoing prime ministers. Admittedly, I haven't read Theresa May's. I don't know if she's done one actually, but it's just an interesting perspective, because at the minute there are a lot more living ex-prime ministers and current than there have ever been because of, well, some reshuffles. But there's still only 8. There's only 8 people alive who know what it's like to try and run the UK. And it's particularly interesting in Boris's case because he was elected on a wave of enthusiasm and popularity, and then basically went under the bus because he was betrayed by his own MPs and went out despised by the country a very short time later. So it's an interesting one in that respect, at least. It's a very interesting perspective on political history going back to the days of Margaret Thatcher, and he does cover all the major events and all the rest of it in the book. I mean, it is a whopper. It's you need some time to get through it, but he does also cover it all with surprising openness, even to the extent, actually, the massively unpopular thing about Tony Blair. I mean, you say the word Tony Blair, you hear someone in the background say warmonger. Boris actually openly says in the book he backed Tony Blair in going to war to remove Saddam Hussein, saying that he thinks Tony Blair was right to stand with America in doing that after New York was attacked. The odd thing that Tony Blair did, in Boris's opinion, just being that he made the argument for these weapons of mass destruction that it doesn't seem there was much evidence for, whereas what he should have just done is said, no, America's been attacked, we're going with them, we're going in solidarity rather than in for this odd reason that wasn't going to hold up. Another very interesting thing is that Boris admits he's not sure lockdown was the right thing to do in dealing with COVID. I have to admit that was kind of my feeling at the time, but that was from the luxurious perspective of living in the countryside, and my job was fine and my friends and family were all safe and no one was asking me to make life and death decisions. But it does seem very bold of Boris to admit now that he's not sure lockdown was actually the right thing to do, especially as there is still knock-on suffering still happening because of it. The question of Brexit, obviously, is still a bit of a tricky one. For my part, personally, I voted Remain, but you could see that there were reasonable arguments for why people would vote for Leave. The impression I get is that most people didn't vote Leave for those reasons. But in reading the book, it's a shame that Boris did the stupid thing with the big bus and all that rubbish, instead of just making the sensible argument that he does in the book, that basically leaving the EU was about democracy. It's difficult to argue with the point that people in Brussels making rules that we have to abide by in the UK, and we have no say in who those people are, we can't remove them if we don't like it. That is a loss of democracy, and that's an undisputable point, I think. So that seems a far more compelling argument for Brexit than did the Boris bus, for example. He does, to be fair, make the reasonable sounding point that a country has to be steered emotionally. You can't steer people rationally, which is interesting. So you have to do it with these little bite-sized headlines. Otherwise you won't change people's feelings on a matter. You just sort of leave them kind of cold, so you won't get anywhere. Personally, I find that a little bit manipulative, but then I guess I can say that because I don't have to convince anybody of anything. The big worry, of course, is it does sort of suggest that people can't be moved by rational, sensible arguments. They have to be moved by very small emotional nudges, and that doesn't seem to say very good things for the world, does it? It sort of suggests that not a lot of thinking is happening. Another bit that surprised me was that he admitted that when he campaigned for Brexit, he didn't have a plan for what Brexit would look like afterwards. And the way he tells that is almost like I'm silly for thinking that he would have done. And maybe he's right, but from my point of view, you kind of think, well, how can you know the thing you're going to is going to be better than the thing you're coming away from? And I don't like that whole better the devil you know thing. But if you're going to undo something, it would seem at least a basic responsibility to try and have a little think about what the alternative might be. I suppose there's an argument that Brexit was inescapably tied with social media, because arguably it was won on social media. I think that's probably reasonable to say. And Arnold Schwarzenegger had a great thing to say about media, or a test you can apply. And the idea is about some sort of article, whatever it is it teaching me something or is it making me feel something? And then Arnie goes on to conclude that we could all do with a rather more teaching these days and a bit less feeling. You end up anyway with this sort of media versus Boris situation, in terms of which is more reliable in terms of conveying what actually the truth is. I only follow the financial news. I find it's quite useful in the sense that the finance industry doesn't want sensational headlines, or it wants information it can actually act upon, so it won't put up with stupid headlines and misleading stuff. So it's very dry news in that respect. So those who might list news following as a hobby would find it frightfully dull, I'm sure. But it is at least, it's more like raw data. So it would pass the Arnie test, whereas the conventional news, like if I want a better term, perhaps doesn't, because it's just fighting for attention and clicks. But either way, I don't quite know if it's possible to believe what Boris says. It sounds terrible, and it's not intended as a personal judgment. It's just a perspective of someone who doesn't know him. This is the third tome I've read on him, with the two Tim Shipmans as well, not written by him, but largely about him on the basis that they're about Brexit. And what comes through in all of it is he's got this supremely can-do, positive, optimistic attitude. But as part of that, he seems like he will just say words to get from point A to point B, and sometimes those words are not entirely correct. In fairness, they're never dull words. Boris is clearly of the school of thought that why say 4 words to convey meaning when you can say 68 words and make it fun as well. But you do meet these people in real life where words just fall out of their face, and you have to sort of sift through it all to figure out what they're actually saying and what the actual facts of it are. That, of course, is much easier if it's someone you spend a lot of time with in real life, because you then have the context around them and you can filter and sift and you get used to them. But when you're dealing with someone like Boris and you don't know him and all you're getting is little snippets from the media and all the rest of it, it's really difficult to find that context to filter through it and figure out, okay, what is he actually saying, what is actually true. There's a great line by Paul Bettany, who's playing Geoffrey Chaucer in A Knight's Tale, and he says, "I'm a writer, I give the truth scope." I love that line. And it is interesting, that, isn't it? Because you get things like, the sky is blue. It's like, well, it's not here at the minute. And the trees are green. Also, December, no green trees out there. Boris definitely does a lot of this oversimplifying, because allegedly that's how politics has to be done. It's an interesting question. Does it? Maybe. But either way, he has clearly failed to build a legacy of honesty. Perhaps that's a ridiculous goal for any politician, because everyone's just going to condemn them as they're all a bunch of cheats and liars and all the rest of it. But Boris does seem to have failed more than most in that sense of getting a reputation for at least trying to be honest, maybe. That being said, throughout the book, he does repeatedly admit things he got wrong and mistakes he made, and very open about being perceived as a prat and all the rest of it. So it's odd that someone could be a terrible liar when they're unwilling to admit to really unpopular things like, I supported Tony Blair and going to get Saddam Hussein. And personally, the overall sense I'm left with is that basically a decent bloke trying to do the best he knew how to do. That will no doubt have all 5 people watching this video yelling at the screen about how naive I am and how I've fallen for Boris's lies and all the rest of it. But I guess that brings us on to what's the most interesting thing about Boris, is that he bothered to get off his arse and go and do something to try and run the country and make it better. Whereas most of us, me included, are not willing to do that. I'm not saying that means I think all politicians are actually wonderful human beings and they're not all terrible. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. I've met 2 maybe in real life ever, and they were both on Transmit. So I've no idea. But I find it unlikely that they're all terrible. But one thing you can say is that when you or I do something, make a mistake at work or do something wrong or something we're not proud of, we are lucky in that we don't have the tabloids then splashing a one-sided account on it on the front covers of everybody to read. There's this fabulous idea in Douglas Adams' book, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, where it talks about the president of the galaxy, and that under no circumstances should anyone who is capable of being elected to that position, they should never be allowed to do that job. And I guess there's more than a whiff of truth to that, isn't there? But ultimately, of course, in the real world, someone's got to do it. I don't particularly want to be the one to do it, and I imagine you probably don't want to be the one to do it either. So, we have to make do, I suppose. So, bottom line for Boris, for me, I struggle to believe some of the things he says, But I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that he still worked his butt off to get to a position to try and be useful in the grandest possible sense and do something for his country to try and make it better. And he admits himself the mistakes he made whilst in that position that ultimately led to his downfall and meant that he didn't get as much done as he'd hoped. You'd also have to say people would struggle to argue that he didn't get the big things broadly right. And granted, it's difficult to know what right is until we've got hindsight. But Brexit, he got that over the line. I didn't vote for it, but the country did, so it had to be done. Boris was the one who basically got it done. COVID, I didn't particularly like lockdown, but anyone in Boris's shoes no one could have made a different decision than lockdown, surely. I mean, I can't imagine I would have had all these scientific advice say you must do this and people are dying left, right and centre. He said, no, let it go. And I think it's fair to say he ran it broadly like a grown-up. I realise his Partygate things aside, I'm not getting into that, I'm not particularly interested in he said, she said. It's not particularly clear. I don't think it particularly matters. At worst, you could say he's naive for not having thought that maybe perceptions were more important than they were, but then he basically admits that in the book anyway. And then he stood up to Putin when he invaded Ukraine. You think that's three whacking great things. I mean, any prime minister might have one of those, but he had three of them within the 10 minutes he was in number 10 and dealt with them all, you've got to say, pretty well. I think that's fair. If nothing else, for those, I would say it's worth reading his book. If nothing else, politics has probably never been phrased in quite such fun terms.